Welcome back to Inside Dark History, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the Coleman family and their sinister 26-year reign of terror that you might have never heard before, a mystery. Buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know, where are you listening to this story from? That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. In the rolling, forgotten hills of southeastern Ohio, where the Hocking River carves its patient path through ancient valleys, stands a weathered stone marker that most locals instinctively avoid after dark. It leans slightly, as if burdened by the weight of the secrets it keeps. Time and a century of harsh winters have worked to erase its message, scouring the surface with ice and wind. But the inscription remains, barely legible, a quiet testament to a buried past. New Canaan Community Farm, 1837 to 1863. In God's grace we trust. The words, meant to offer comfort and closure, do the opposite. They feel like a mockery, a final cynical lie etched in stone. For what the cold granite fails to mention, what the official histories have meticulously scrubbed from their pages, are the 234 souls who perished on that very land. It offers no explanation for why, on still windless nights, the skeletal remains of the old Coleman family barn seem to echo with sounds that have no earthly source. Local lore, passed down not in books but in hushed warnings from one generation to the next, speaks of the faint, desperate tolling of a bell that was consumed by fire more than a century and a half ago. It whispers of the thin, reedy cry of a child calling for a mother long turned to dust, a sound that hangs in the heavy air before vanishing as suddenly as it appeared. For over 150 years, the descendants of Athens County have kept this story locked away. It is not a tale for public record, but a grim inheritance of fear, a cautionary fable told around winter fires to warn children away from the haunted valley. It is a story so disturbing, so contrary to the pioneering spirit of the American frontier, that it challenges our very understanding of faith, family, and the profound darkness that can fester in the human heart when left unchecked in isolation. How does a community founded on the promise of divine salvation become a meticulously managed graveyard? And more terrifyingly, how does the world allow such a place to exist, and then, to be forgotten? To unravel the answers, to understand the horror that unfolded in that secluded valley, we must first step back in time. We must travel back to the year 1837. America was a young nation, brimming with a fervent, almost desperate, hunger for salvation. The Second Great Awakening, a powerful wave of religious revivalism, had swept across the frontier like a spiritual wildfire. It was a movement born of emotion, not intellect. A rejection of the cold rationalism of the Enlightenment in favor of a personal, all-consuming relationship with God. Traveling preachers held massive revival meetings in open fields, their voices thundering with promises of heaven and threats of hellfire, moving entire crowds to tears, to ecstatic shouting, to public confessions of sin. This spiritual fervor left in its wake countless souls hungry for a more perfect, more direct union with the divine, and it made them profoundly vulnerable to any charismatic leader who claimed to have a direct line to the Almighty. Athens County, Ohio, in the winter of that year, was a land caught between two worlds. The bustling trade routes of the Ohio River had brought whispers of prosperity and civilization to some, but these were just whispers. The reality for most was a brutal, unforgiving existence. Small, isolated farming communities dotted the landscape, connected only by treacherous, muddy roads that became impassable with the first frost. Life was a relentless cycle of backbreaking labor, a constant battle against disease, crop failure, and the bone-deep chill of the Ohio winter. The fear of God was very real, but it was matched by the more immediate fears of starvation, of sickness, of a loneliness so profound it could break a person's spirit. It was a place where neighbors were distant, where law was a far-off concept, and where a family's survival depended entirely on their own fortitude and the whims of an unpredictable God. It was here, in a valley sheltered by ancient oaks and shielded from prying eyes, that a man named Elder Daniel Coleman first laid his gaze upon the 400 acres that would soon become his kingdom of horrors. The land itself seemed almost preordained for his purposes, a natural accomplice to the darkness he carried within him. A 2-story brick house, built like a fortress with thick walls and small, watchful windows, sat enthroned on a hill overlooking the entire valley. It was a structure designed not for comfort, but for control. Below, the land stretched in every direction, fertile fields that promised bountiful harvests, dense woodlands that offered endless lumber, and a clear stream that whispered of fresh water year-round. Most importantly, the property was a fortress of solitude, surrounded by miles of forest that would muffle any sounds of prayer, of work, of suffering that might disturb the handful of neighboring farms miles away. It was a place where a community could be born, or where it could vanish without a trace. And into this volatile landscape of faith and fear, a new figure arrived, seemingly sent by providence itself. Elder Daniel Coleman was a man who commanded attention. He was tall and striking, with a posture that radiated an unshakable certainty. But it was his eyes that people remembered, piercing blue eyes that seemed to look not merely at a person, but directly into the hidden chambers of their soul, seeing their hopes, their fears, their secret sins. At 42, he possessed a voice that was a finely tuned instrument of manipulation. It could fall to a gentle, confidential whisper that made you feel like the only person in the world, or rise to a thundering crescendo that, according to the few existing accounts from the era, could make hardened sinners weep and devout saints question their own faith. His history, as he told it, was a compelling saga of tragedy and divine purpose. He claimed to have already buried 2 beloved wives, both taken by swift, cruel illnesses, their deaths only strengthening his resolve to serve the Lord. He spoke of receiving visions directly from the Almighty, vivid, detailed messages intended for a chosen flock he was destined to lead out of a corrupt and fallen world. He was not merely a preacher. He was a prophet. He was not alone. The Coleman family moved as a single, cohesive unit, a living embodiment of the patriarchal order he preached. By his side was his current wife, Sarah, a woman 20 years his junior, whom he publicly and reverently called Mother Sarah. She carried herself not with the uncertainty of youth, but with the stern, unyielding authority of a woman twice her age. Her eyes, unlike her husband's, held no fire. They were cold, placid pools, reflecting a terrifyingly complete submission to his will. She was the enforcer of the domestic sphere, her chilling silence often more effective than her husband's sermons. Their 3 children, 16-year-old Joshua, 14-year-old Rebecca, and 12-year-old Ezra, were living extensions of their father's dominion. They had been raised not as children in any conventional sense, but as acolytes in a cult of personality. They were taught from birth to view their father not merely as a parent, but as God's chosen vessel on earth, his word infallible, his commands absolute. Joshua, the eldest, already had his father's cold gaze. Rebecca, watchful and intelligent, learned early that piety could be a mask for observation. And young Ezra, quiet and sullen, showed flashes of a cruelty that seemed out of place in a child so young. The family arrived in Athens County with a story of religious persecution and a wagon heavy with gold coins, a startling, almost contradictory, combination that immediately set them apart. Daniel's narrative was powerful and persuasive, tailored perfectly for the anxieties of the time. He spoke of corrupt church leaders in Pennsylvania, of communities that had lost their way to worldly temptations, and of God's personal call for him to establish a new Eden, a sanctuary where the truly faithful could live in perfect, communal harmony, free from the sins of the outside world. The cash purchase of the sprawling 400-acre property was a transaction that sent ripples of gossip through the local community. In a region where barter was common and hard currency was a scarce commodity, the sight of so much gold was both awe-inspiring and suspicious. Yet, any nascent suspicion was quickly washed away by a tide of irresistible opportunity. Coleman began offering employment to anyone willing to work his fields. His charisma and apparent wealth, a powerful balm for a community struggling with the harsh realities of frontier life. He was not just a preacher with a vision. He was a provider with capital. And in the desperate calculations of 1830s Ohio, that was more than enough to earn their trust. The glaring contradiction: a man preaching the rejection of earthly possessions while possessing a fortune was a question few dared to ask. They could not have known, could not have allowed themselves to imagine that the foundation of this new paradise was not being laid with faith, but with a currency of deceit, and that its architect was not a prophet, but a predator of the highest and most patient order. With the trust of the local community secured and the land consecrated to his dark purpose, Elder Daniel Coleman began the true work of building his empire. He did not build it with brick and mortar alone, but with words carefully chosen, printed on cheap paper, and sent out like apostles into the desperate corners of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. The advertisements that appeared in regional newspapers throughout the spring of 1838 were masterpieces of psychological manipulation, appealing directly to the deepest fears and most fervent hopes of the American frontier family. They spoke of a Christian sanctuary, a new Canaan where God's will was the only law. They promised shared prosperity, a life free from the corrupting influence of money and worldly goods. But the most seductive promise, the one that resonated in the hearts of parents who had buried children and farmers who had lost their land, was that of guaranteed salvation. No worldly possessions required, the text read. Only faith, willing hands, and a pure desire to serve the Lord. To a family huddled in a one-room cabin, facing another year of uncertainty, these words were not an advertisement. They were a divine invitation. And so, they came. The first to arrive was the Henderson family, their gaunt faces etched with the hardships of a failed farm in Pennsylvania. They brought their 4 children and a lifetime of belongings packed into a single, creaking wagon, their eyes wide with a hope that was painful to behold. 2 weeks later, the Millers followed, then the Washingtons, the Thompsons, and the Prices. Each family was greeted personally by Elder Coleman at the gates of the valley. He would take the father's hand in a firm grip, look him squarely in the eye, and speak with such unshakable conviction about God's grand plan for their community that even the most skeptical hearts were won over. He was offering them not just refuge, but purpose. They did not know, could not comprehend, that they were willingly handing over their lives, their children, and their futures to a man who saw their faith not as a virtue, but as a vulnerability to be exploited. The early days at New Canaan seemed to fulfill every promise Coleman had made. Families were given well-built cabins, simple but sturdy. They shared their meals in a large, common dining hall, the air filled with the sounds of hymns and hopeful chatter. The work was undeniably hard, clearing dense forests, tilling stubborn soil, raising barns and workshops from the ground up, but it felt meaningful. It was the work of building a new world. Elder Coleman himself was a constant presence in those first months, his sleeves rolled up, his hands stained with the same honest dirt as everyone else's. He spoke often of the early Christians, citing Scripture to sanctify their communal lifestyle. "We are one family under God," he would declare, his voice carrying across the fields. sharing all things in common, our hearts and souls united in his purpose. But as the first summer waned and the vibrant greens of Ohio faded into the weary browns of autumn, subtle changes began to creep into the fabric of daily life, like a slow, insidious poison. The workdays, once bounded by the reasonable light of the sun, grew longer, stretching into the twilight hours. The hearty meals in the common hall became thinner, the portions smaller, justified by Coleman as a necessary spiritual discipline. The flesh must be weakened, he would say during the now mandatory evening services, his eyes scanning the faces of his flock, so that the spirit may grow strong and be worthy of salvation. The punishments for minor infractions, a moment of rest in the fields, a complaint about the food, a question about a decision, grew more severe. The transgressor would be forced into a public confession, made to stand before the entire community and admit to their spiritual weakness and sinful pride, their humiliation serving as a stark warning to all others. The paradise was beginning to reveal its iron bars. The first death came in the cold, damp autumn of 1838, just 6 months after the community's founding. Thomas Henderson, the patriarch who had led his family from Pennsylvania with such radiant hope, collapsed while clearing stumps from the unforgiving North Field. He was dead before he hit the ground. The official cause of death, as meticulously recorded by Elder Coleman in a large, leather-bound ledger, was heart failure, brought on by the overwhelming joy of serving the Lord. But that night, in the dark confines of her cabin, Martha Henderson whispered a different truth to her frightened children. She spoke of 16-hour workdays, of a diet of thin vegetable soup and stale bread, and of a husband who had been worked to death. The funeral was a grand theatrical performance orchestrated by Coleman. The entire community gathered at sunset around a simple grave marked only by a crude wooden cross. Coleman delivered a sermon that lasted nearly 3 hours, his voice rolling thunder that echoed across the valley. He spoke of Brother Thomas's blessed transition, of the privilege the community had been given to witness such divine favor firsthand. "Brother Thomas has been called home," he declared, his arms outstretched to the heavens. "He has shown us the path to glory, a path of total surrender to God's will." He was not mourning a death. He was celebrating a sacrifice, and in doing so he was sanctifying the very conditions that had caused it. As the weeks turned into months, more members began to notice the disturbing patterns, the chilling disparities that could no longer be ignored. The Coleman family, Daniel, Sarah, and their 3 children, never seemed to suffer from the bone-deep exhaustion that plagued everyone else. They took their meals separately, in the warmth and comfort of the main house, while the rest of the community shivered in the drafty common hall. Their clothes were always clean, well-mended, and made of fine wool, a stark contrast to the increasingly ragged garments of the other families, which were never replaced. Most troubling of all were the sounds. Those who slept in the cabins nearest the main house began to report hearing things in the dead of night, sounds that seemed impossible in their austere, pious community. The faint, melodic notes of a piano. The unmistakable sound of laughter, rich and unrestrained. The delicate clinking of fine china and silverware. When a brave soul dared to question Elder Coleman about these reports, he would fix the inquirer with his piercing gaze, his expression a mask of disappointed sorrow. He would speak of the spiritual rewards that came only to those who had fully surrendered their earthly desires, implying that the questioner's lack of faith was the only thing preventing them from hearing the music of the angels as well. The inquiry was turned back on them as a sign of their own spiritual failure. The second death came in the heart of that first brutal winter. Mary Washington, a young mother of 3, was found frozen in her bed. The cabin she shared with her husband and children had run out of firewood 2 days earlier. Their desperate request for more had been personally denied by 17-year-old Joshua Coleman, who was now in charge of all community supplies. His justification was that the Washington family had not met their work quota for the week. At Mary's funeral, Elder Coleman's eulogy was chillingly brief. "Sister Mary has been taken by the Lord's mercy," he announced, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "She has been spared the trials that yet await us all." By the end of that first winter, 7 members of the new Canaan community were dead. Each death was explained away as divine providence. Each funeral another opportunity for Coleman to reinforce his absolute control over the terrified survivors. The community was now a sealed world. Communication with the outside was forbidden. Letters were collected, ostensibly for delivery, but were first censored by a stern, watchful Rebecca Coleman, who claimed to be protecting the flock from worldly influences that might weaken their faith. In reality, she was cutting them off from any hope of rescue. It was a 14-year-old boy, however, who would be the first to stumble upon the true, material nature of the Coleman's evil. Peter Miller had been raised on a farm and possessed a practical curiosity that had not yet been extinguished by the daily regimen of labor and prayer. Tasked with cleaning the community's large root cellar, located directly beneath the Coleman's main house, his hand brushed against a loose stone in the wall. Behind it, he found a hidden chamber. It was not filled with food, but with treasure. Watches, gold lockets, wedding rings, ornate family Bibles, and even a collection of the strange, new things called photographs, all items that had belonged to the community members who had died. These were things that should have been sent to relatives or buried with their owners, not hoarded like a pirate's bounty. With the naive courage of youth, Peter took his discovery directly to Elder Coleman, expecting shock and outrage. Instead, he was met with a serene, chilling smile. Coleman told the boy that his mind had been polluted by worldly thoughts and that he would require a special, private spiritual cleansing to purify him. That night, Peter Miller disappeared from his cabin. The official story, announced by Coleman the next morning, was that the boy had run away, his weak spirit unable to handle the discipline required for true spiritual growth. But his mother, Elizabeth Miller, a quiet woman now hollowed by grief, found what the others missed: a small dark trail of frozen blood, drops leading from the door of Peter's cabin into the dark woods behind the main house. She knew her son had not left voluntarily. She looked at the main house, at the windows that seemed like vacant eyes, and for the first time she understood. This was not God's house. It was a slaughterhouse. The disappearance of Peter Miller marked a crucial turning point. The pattern was now terrifyingly clear to anyone brave enough to see it. New Canaan was not a sanctuary. It was a prison camp where the Coleman family grew rich on stolen wealth, while their followers died from deliberate neglect, systematic overwork, and, as the blood in the snow suggested, something far worse. Yet this revelation brought no rebellion. It brought only a deeper, more pervasive fear. Escape seemed impossible. The nearest town was 15 miles away through dangerous, wolf-infested woods, and Coleman had spent months convincing them that the outside world was filled with literal demons waiting to devour their souls. Their bodies were trapped by the geography of the valley, and their minds were trapped by the theology of their prophet. The community, now a complex and horrifying machine, fell into a rigid hierarchy designed to perpetuate the Coleman's power. Elder Daniel was the unquestioned God King, his word divine law. Mother Sarah, a phantom of cold authority, oversaw the women's work, kitchens, laundry, childcare with an iron fist, her punishments leaving psychological scars that never faded. Joshua, now fully grown into his father's cruel image, controlled all supplies and work assignments, wielding the power of life and death through the allocation of food and firewood. Rebecca, whose beauty was now a weapon she used to charm, disarm, and inform on community members, served as her father's secretary and enforcer of ideological purity. And young Ezra, now a teenager, was being groomed for the family business. already showing a proclivity for violence that unsettled even his older siblings. The work routine was designed to break both body and spirit, a relentless cycle of exhaustion that began at 4 a.m. with the ringing of a bell and often ended near midnight after a grueling evening service of forced confession and psychological torment. It was in these services that the true horror was refined. Coleman would single out individuals, dissect their supposed sins in front of their peers, and force them to beg for his forgiveness, effectively destroying their social bonds and leaving them utterly dependent on him. This was the state of New Canaan for years, a slow, grinding nightmare from which there was no awakening. The great, shocking revelation was not a single event, but a dawning collective understanding among the broken. This was not a temporary trial. This was their life, and it would also be their death. For more than a decade, this grim routine was the only reality the people of New Canaan knew. An entire generation of children was born into this world, knowing nothing but the 4 a.m. bell, the gnawing hunger, and the divine authority of Elder Coleman. Hope for most had withered and died, replaced by a dull, silent resignation. But in the brutal winter of 1851, a crisis that should have solidified the Coleman's power would, through a twist of fate, inadvertently plant the seeds of a rebellion. A severe outbreak of influenza swept through the overcrowded, poorly heated cabins, and death, already a constant companion, became a daily visitor. It was during this plague that a quiet widow named Anna Thompson was assigned to help care for the sick. Anna had arrived at New Canaan 3 years earlier, her 2 young children in tow, her spirit broken by the loss of her husband. Her nursing duties, born of necessity, gave her a pass to move freely throughout the community, granting her access to cabins and conversations that were normally forbidden. And what she began to witness made her blood run cold. She saw that the influenza was not merely a natural disaster. It was being actively weaponized. She watched in silent horror as Rebecca Coleman, now a striking young woman of 19, moved from cabin to cabin with a beatific smile on her face, delivering blankets and broth. But Anna, with her keen observer's eye, noticed the blankets were often taken from the beds of those who had just died, and that those who received Rebecca's special care often sickened the fastest. Rebecca was not an angel of mercy. She was an angel of death, ensuring the weakest and most infirm members of the community would not survive the winter. The irrefutable proof, the key that would unlock the entire conspiracy, came to Anna not through observation, but by chance. Assigned to clean out the cabin of the recently deceased Williams family, all 4 of them gone in a single week, she felt a loose floorboard beneath her worn-out shoe. Prying it open with trembling fingers, she found a small, oilcloth-wrapped parcel. Inside was a journal. It belonged to Robert Williams, a former schoolteacher who, unlike so many others, had never surrendered his intellect. For 2 years he had secretly documented everything. The journal's pages, filled with a small, precise script, were a meticulous record of systematic murder, theft, and abuse. Anna's hands shook as she read. Williams had recorded dates, names, and methods. He noted how food was deliberately withheld from families who showed signs of discontent. He documented the so-called accidents that inevitably befell those who asked too many questions. He detailed how the Coleman family had amassed a fortune built on the blood and suffering of their followers. Most disturbingly, Williams, with his teacher's knowledge of science, had concluded that many deaths were not from common illness, but from a poison whose symptoms, vomiting, cramps, delirium, mimicked diseases like cholera or dysentery. But the final entry, written just a day before the Williams family fell ill, contained the most explosive revelation of all. Through a conversation overheard between drunken delivery men, Robert Williams had discovered that Daniel Coleman was an assumed identity. The prophet's real name was David Colelton, and he was a man wanted by authorities in 3 states for fraud and murder. The deaths of his previous wives had not been acts of God. and the religious persecution he claimed to have fled was in fact a murder warrant issued after the suspicious death of a wealthy widow who had named him the sole heir to her estate. The entire foundation of New Canaan was not just a lie. It was a criminal enterprise, a franchise of horror conceived by a fugitive murderer. Anna Thompson now held the truth in her hands, a truth so heavy it felt like it could burn her to the bone. Anna now faced an impossible choice: expose the truth and be killed for it, or remain silent and watch more innocents die. The decision, however, was made for her. She began to feel Rebecca Coleman's eyes on her, following her as she moved through the community. The friendly greetings were gone, replaced by a cold, calculating watchfulness. A summons finally came during a particularly brutal February blizzard. Anna was called to the main house for what Rebecca termed private spiritual counseling. But instead of the usual psychological manipulation, Anna was led down a flight of stone steps into the damp, cold basement. Here, the full monstrous reality of the Coleman operation was unveiled. The whispered rumors were true. The basement chambers were not for food storage. They were torture rooms. Manacles hung from the stone walls, and a large, blood-stained wooden table stood in the center of one room. Rebecca, now 22 and fully initiated into her family's darkest methods, explained to Anna exactly what would happen to her and her children if she spoke a word of what she knew. "You have seen too much, Sister Anna," Rebecca said, her voice as cold as the winter wind howling outside. "But you are not the first. The choice is simple. Join us in our work, become one of the shepherds instead of the sheep, or you and your children will join the others in their eternal rest." This direct threat, however, had an unintended effect. It extinguished Anna's fear and ignited a fire of pure, desperate resolve. She knew she was not alone in her suspicions. In the weeks that followed, moving with extreme caution, she sought out the others she had identified by the silent despair in their eyes. Margaret Foster, whose husband had died in a suspicious mill accident the previous year. David Chun, a skilled carpenter who had been forced to build hidden compartments in the Coleman house and knew the extent of their hoarded wealth. Sarah Martinez, a young mother whose two healthiest children had been taken by the Colemans for special education and were never seen again. This small, secret cabal began to meet in the dead of night, using the cover of their work duties to share information. Their combined knowledge was staggering. They discovered that the Coleman family's wealth was hidden not just in the cellar, but in caches throughout the property. They confirmed that several community members who had disappeared were being held prisoner in the basement chambers before being quietly eliminated. And then came the final terrifying revelation, pieced together from a drunken boast by Joshua Coleman to a visiting trader. The family was planning a great purification for the annual spring festival. Their plan was to blame the deaths on a new, more virulent disease outbreak, dispose of the bodies in a mass grave, and start fresh with a new group of unsuspecting victims. The breakthrough, the detail that turned their desperate plan into a concrete timeline, came from an unexpected source. Timothy Walsh, a 15-year-old boy who had been born and raised in the community, had been assigned to work in the Coleman family's private kitchen. He approached Anna, his face pale with terror. He had overheard the final details. The Great Purification was scheduled for the first week of April. The entire community would be poisoned with arsenic-laced food during the festival's final feast. Then, the Colemans would burn the main buildings to destroy all evidence, claiming it was an attempt to stop the spread of the disease. Timothy's information also confirmed their worst fears. Joshua Coleman had been in contact with associates in Kentucky and Tennessee. They were planning to abandon the Ohio location and move their entire operation, leaving behind nothing but a mass grave. The night of April 5, 1852, would be remembered as the longest night in the history of Athens County. The spring festival had begun 3 days earlier, a macabre parody of celebration. As the sun set on that cold April evening, the final feast began. While the community filed into the main hall, Anna Thompson and David Chun slipped into the basement of the Coleman house to gather the one thing that could prove their story: Robert Williams's journal and the Colemans' own meticulous financial ledgers. Above them, the feast had begun with Elder Coleman's longest sermon yet. But as the poisoned food was served, a strange, bitter taste lingered. People began to feel dizzy. An elderly man collapsed, then another. Panic began to ripple through the crowd, a low murmur of fear and confusion. It was Timothy Walsh, watching from the kitchen, who saw Rebecca adding a final white powder to the stew. He burst into the hall, his voice cracking with terror as he screamed the one word that shattered the illusion forever. Poison! They're poisoning us! Chaos erupted. The Coleman family's response was swift and brutal. Joshua produced a rifle from behind the speaker's podium and fired into the crowd. Ezra blocked the main exit with a heavy wooden bar, a wild, ecstatic grin on his face. Sarah Coleman moved through the panicked throngs with a butcher knife, cutting down anyone who tried to resist. But they had underestimated the desperate strength of people with nothing left to lose. The victims became fighters. Margaret Foster and Sarah Martinez smashed windows, helping people escape into the night. David Chun, emerging from the basement, just as the fire set by the Colemans began to take hold, organized a group of men who fought back with chairs, tools, and bare hands. The main hall, once a place of forced worship, became a battlefield, an inferno of screams, gunshots, and cracking, burning timber. By dawn on April 6th, the carefully constructed world of the Coleman family lay in smoldering ruins. The fire, a beacon of destruction, had drawn the attention of neighboring farms and, eventually, the authorities from Athens. The scene that greeted them was one of apocalyptic horror. Of the nearly 400 people who had lived in the community, only 87 had survived the night. Many who escaped the fire died in the surrounding woods, the slow-acting arsenic finishing its deadly work. Justice, when it came, was as swift and brutal as the crimes it sought to punish. Daniel Coleman, the prophet of God, was found in his private office, cornered and killed by a group of enraged survivors. His famous piercing blue eyes had been gouged out. Sarah Coleman died in the fire, her body found in the ashes of the main hall, her charred fingers fused to a half-melted bag of gold coins. Joshua Coleman was captured as he tried to flee on horseback. His trial in Athens became a statewide sensation, as witness after witness took the stand to recount the horrors they had endured. He remained unrepentant to the end and was publicly hanged in September of that year. Rebecca Coleman was found alive in the ruins, severely burned but coherent. In the 3 weeks she lingered in a Cincinnati hospital, she gave a full confession, revealing the scope of her family's crimes and the locations of their other operations in Kentucky and Tennessee. Her confession led to the discovery of a criminal network that had been responsible for the deaths of over 800 people. Her last words were reportedly a plea for a forgiveness that came 15 years too late. Only one escaped. Ezra Coleman, the youngest and perhaps most volatile, was seen fleeing on foot into the deep woods during the chaos. Despite extensive searches, his body was never found, leaving a lingering, unanswered question: had the evil truly been vanquished, or had one of its seeds escaped to take root in some other dark, forgotten corner of the country? While the shadow of Ezra Coleman's escape lingered over the region, a chilling, unresolved chord in the symphony of horrors for the 87 survivors of the massacre. The end of the Colemans was not an end to their suffering. They were free from the valley of death, but they could never truly leave it behind. The physical chains were broken, but the psychological ones, forged in years of terror, starvation, and systematic dehumanization, would prove to be far more durable. They were no longer captives, but they were not yet whole. The world they returned to was one they no longer recognized nor trusted. How could they explain the years stolen from them? How could they describe a reality so monstrous that it defied belief? Many were haunted by a profound and crippling guilt, the survivor's burden. Why had they lived when their friends, their spouses, their children had perished? Why hadn't they acted sooner? These questions tormented their days and fueled their nightmares. They saw betrayal in the eyes of strangers and heard Coleman's sermons in the whisper of the wind. They had been taught to see the world as a battleground between God and demons, and though the primary demons were now dead, the world still felt teeming with menace. Yet, in the midst of this profound collapse, glimmers of incredible human resilience began to emerge. The very people who had been most broken by the Coleman's reign dedicated their shattered lives to rebuilding. Anna Thompson, the woman who had discovered the journal, became a tireless advocate for the rights of religious minorities, testifying before state committees to ensure that no community could again operate with such deadly secrecy. David Chun, the carpenter whose skills had been co-opted for evil, now used his hands for healing, leading the construction of new homes for the orphaned and destitute survivors. Margaret Foster and Sarah Martinez, the two mothers who had fought so fiercely during the massacre, established a small school for the children left behind, determined to give them the education and safety that had been stolen from them. They were redefining their lives not by the trauma they had endured, but by the compassion they were determined to create in its wake. As for the land itself, the 400 acres of New Canaan, it was deemed cursed. No one would buy it, no one would farm it. The ground was considered poisoned, not by arsenic, but by the sheer weight of the suffering it had absorbed. By order of the state government, the remaining structures that had not been consumed by the fire were torn down, the woods salvaged and burned, as if attempting to erase the very memory from the landscape. The foundation of the main house was filled in, the fields were left fallow, and the valley was abandoned, surrendered back to the patient, inexorable advance of the Ohio wilderness. Within a few years, new trees began to grow over the unmarked graves, and thorny brambles covered the scars in the earth, a green shroud over a history too terrible to face. But a truth, once known, can never be truly erased. It can only be buried. In the years following the trials, a strange and deliberate silence fell over the official history of the new Canaan Community Farm. The court records, containing hundreds of pages of harrowing testimony, were sealed by judicial order. Historians note that this was likely done for a number of reasons. The authorities were deeply embarrassed by their failure to investigate earlier reports of abuse. Local politicians wished to distance themselves from a scandal that revealed their own negligence. And on a deeper level, the story was simply too dark, too anomalous to fit into the triumphant narrative of westward expansion. It was a chapter that was easier to rip out than to understand. And so, as the official record fell silent, the story of the Coleman family began its long migration into the realm of folklore. The facts, once sharp and clear, began to blur. The number of dead shifted with each telling. The cruelty of the Colemans became legendary, almost supernatural. The story became a cautionary tale whispered by parents, a fire and brimstone sermon used by preachers to warn against the dangers of false prophets. It survived not as documented history, but as a haunting. This haunting was kept alive by the lingering, unanswered questions that clung to the valley like a morning fog. What truly became of Ezra Coleman? For decades, sightings were reported, a man with his description seen working the docks in New Orleans, a quiet, paranoid farmhand in Missouri who vanished when asked about his past. But he was never caught. The possibility that he lived out a long life, or worse, started his own dark ministry elsewhere, remains one of the story's most chilling loose ends. And what of the true death toll? The 234 bodies accounted for by the Thea State were only those found after the fire. Robert Williams's journal spoke of dozens more, buried in unmarked graves throughout the property, their existence known only to God and their murderers. The full scale of the slaughter at New Canaan can never and will never be known. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire affair was the revelation, from Rebecca's confession, that New Canaan was not an isolated incident, but the headquarters of a network. While authorities were able to shut down the nascent operations in Kentucky and Tennessee, her delirious, pain-filled testimony was often incoherent. The question that haunted investigators for years was, were there others? Were there more New Canaans operating under different names that simply collapsed and vanished when news of the Ohio massacre spread? The records are silent. The truth may be buried in countless other forgotten valleys across the American frontier. The legacy of New Canaan was more than just the ghost stories of a single Ohio valley. The affair sent a shockwave through the heart of the Second Great Awakening. The very idea that a community built on such fervent public faith could be a cover for systematic evil shook the trust of thousands. It revealed the dark underbelly of the revivalist movement, how the same emotional fervor and unquestioning belief that could lead to spiritual renewal could also be the perfect tools for a sociopath. It was a profound loss of innocence, a permanent stain on the era's optimistic faith. The Coleman family's success was a terrifying testament to the vulnerability of people in crisis and the dangerous, absolute power that can be wielded by those willing to exploit the human need for hope. Years later, Timothy Walsh, the brave 15-year-old who raised the first alarm, became a respected minister himself. His sermons, however, were always marked by a deep, sorrowful awareness of the darkness that can lurk within the human heart. In his final sermon, delivered in a small Ohio church shortly before his death in 1903, he spoke words that still echo with the weight of his experience. "Do not be deceived," he told his congregation, his voice raspy with age. "Evil does not always announce itself with horns and a pitchfork. Sometimes it comes wearing the robes of righteousness, speaking the language of salvation and promising the very thing we most desperately need to believe. The most dangerous monsters are the ones who offer us a key to heaven, while quietly locking the gates of hell behind us." Today, the stone marker is all that remains. It is visited by few, a forgotten monument to a forgotten tragedy. But the story of the New Canaan Community Farm is more than a relic of a violent past. It is a timeless and vital warning. The names change, the locations shift, but the fundamental pattern remains. The greatest crime of the Coleman family was not the murder of 234 people. It was the murder of their faith, their hope, and their trust in the goodness of humanity. The question it leaves us with is not just about the darkness that existed in one man's heart, but about the conditions that allow such darkness to flourish, and how easily we, in our own search for answers and salvation, might fail to see the monster standing right in front of us, Bible in hand.